Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another In Tune interview where we talk to composers about the music that they compose. I'm Steven, once again, your host, and Bryan has gotten lost in the woods. It's kind of his hobby at this point, so he's not here. We're thinking it might be the Faron woods, but that's up to debate as of now. We actually have a repeat guest with us today, someone who you might have known from the past, Rebecca Tripp. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, Steven.
Hey, how you doing today?
Pretty good. Happy to be back on here.
Nice. Me too. And for those of you who may not remember, Rebecca has done all sorts of musical arrangements of video games and otherwise, but we're going to be talking about The Legend of Zelda today. But before we get onto that, could you maybe give us a little quick overview of what kind of music you make?
I would say it's sort of I would call it a combination of video game music, classical, and world music. So I'd call it very chill, sort of romantic style, orchestral music with a lot of Celtic influence.
And a lot of that has been game stuff, but others are just original compositions, right?
Oh yeah, most of my work's original, but the game stuff's a lot more popular and it's a lot more fun.
Well, it's not too surprising. You add Zelda to a title and you'll get a whole new fan base immediately installed, and that can be fun. So, I mean, since we've actually already done an interview with you before, a lot of people might already know sort of your history with music and everything. So let's focus a little more on Zelda, because last time we talked Final Fantasy VI. So the medley this time, by the way, we've done a lot of album interviews recently, a lot of broad overviews of large quantities of music, but now we're getting back to the basics and talking about a single song. The catch is that the single song could potentially contain an entire album in and of itself.
Yeah, it's 31 minutes long, so yeah.
And this is the Twilight Princess arrangement. So before we start talking about the music, what's your history with Zelda? I guess you're a longtime Zelda fan?
Oh yeah. I started the series when I was 10. Link to the Past and Link's Awakening pretty much at the same time. In the last interview, I talked about how Final Fantasy pretty much changed my life. Well, Zelda did that too, only it did it first. I always liked video games, but the first time I saw Link to the Past in particular, I realized that video games were an art form. That's what sort of clued me into what I wanted to do with my life and what my real interests were.
I think a lot of people had, if not an identical, a similar reaction to A Link to the Past.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, I didn't start Zelda until quite a bit later than that, but even going back, I can see the footprints.
What was your first one?
First Zelda game I ever played was actually Wind Waker.
Ooh, well, that's a good place to start.
It very much has a special place in my heart. It took no adjustment, learning about this new, sort of cartoony, lovely Zelda world, because it was the first one I ever knew about. So It was perfectly natural. I loved it, and I loved all of the other games since then. So
I'm kind of already biased towards the series and whatnot, but I would say that Wind Waker is a 10 out of 10 game. It's phenomenal. There's so many things about it that are really good. Mm-hmm. And just, if you didn't know, I have a Wind Waker orchestral medley too.
I did know about that. I've listened to it. It's one of my favorites of yours, actually.
Thank you.
It turned out really well. It's such a special musical style that game nailed.
It's actually my favorite of all of my medleys that I've ever done. I've done about 100.
Nice.
But that one in particular, I guess I just poured so much of my joy into it. And when I did this Twilight Princess one, it's the only one that tied with it when I finished.
Oh, really? Well, hopefully someday we can talk about the Wind Waker one at some point. I would love to do that. It's still my favorite Zelda game, so that would be great.
Mm-hmm. My favorites are probably Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time, but honestly, it's very close between those and some of the others, including Wind Waker. And Link Between Worlds kind of stole my heart recently, but I think in terms of story, it's Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask for me. So what would you say is your second favorite?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Hearing you talk, I started thinking, well, maybe that's my favorite. No, actually, maybe that's my favorite. But I suppose I'd have to say Ocarina of Time is my second favorite, though for quite a long time, I held up Majora's Mask as the greatest Zelda game. So I do change my mind as the years pass and I learn more about them and kind of change my, I don't know.
They're all kind of great for different reasons, you know? I would say that Majora's Mask and Wind Waker had the deepest character development, but probably by a long shot. A couple other games came a little bit close. There was a bit of that in Twilight Princess, especially with Midna, and a couple of the NPCs. You got to see more insight into them and everything. But Majora's Mask was the first time a Zelda game made me cry. Let's put it that way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Majora's Mask was, I think, emotionally and thematically the most interesting and arresting of all of the Zelda games. It's the one I enjoy thinking about the most, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it did something to me. A lot of video games did something to me psychologically, almost like a plateau in my creative development. Link to the Past is the earliest memory of at least video games doing that, as I mentioned, but Majora's Mask is the next one after FF6.
So where does Twilight Princess lie in the pantheon of Zelda for you?
I would say that Twilight Princess is my favorite world setting in the series. And it completely stole my heart. It just had this big open world. All of the textures were incredibly elaborate for their time. And it was made in the Wind Waker engine, which was interesting. You probably already know it was originally made for the GameCube. And it played the same as Wind Waker, but I felt like in some ways the controls had been perfected. That might have been my imagination.
Whether it was built on the same engine or not, it's kind of phenomenal how different it feels than Wind Waker. It feels a little more refined, but you would never guess that it shared so much DNA, you know, besides the fact that all of the Zelda games up to this point have a certain similar heart to them.
Yeah, I mean, the gameplay mechanics are the only thing that is sort of a clue to that. Link can do all the same moves, all the sword techniques, and he can hang on the ledge and all that. And
Twilight Princess was sort of a special Zelda game for me because it was the first game in this series that I got to experience the anticipation for. Because like I said, Wind Waker was my first Zelda game, so I just stumbled into it. Then I went back and played Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask and some of the older ones. And then when Twilight Princess came up on the horizon, I was so excited because I finally got to experience what it was like to look forward to a Zelda game.
Yeah, it's a really nice feeling.
I can certainly say it did not disappoint. My favorite anecdote from playing Twilight Princess was Bryan and I sitting on the floor, and I was about 16, I guess, when it came out. Sitting on the floor for so long that I remember it was somewhere in the water temple that I realized I had forgotten how to stand up. And it took me about 30 seconds to realize that I could use my legs once again, and I should probably get something to eat.
You just didn't want to stop.
Yeah, no, it was really one of those games. I did not want to stop until the very end.
And of course, while we're here, the music was a really big part of that.
Definitely.
It followed in Wind Waker's footsteps in terms of soundtrack development. A similar group of composers and a similar placement of music. It had tiny little themes for individual things, individual boss themes. Lots more cutscene music that's just unique to one little scene. Lots of variants on all the characters' themes. That didn't happen until Wind Waker in the series.
Yeah, definitely. It worked on that in a lot of ways while still sticking to that very deliberate and, for me, nostalgic Zelda stylings. Though the music did take a while to grow on me, I will have to admit. When I first heard the Hyrule Field song, for some reason, I was not sold. I was not impressed. I wasn't at all sure about it.
Oh, that's funny.
I know, and now it's just one of the most memorable, heartfelt songs in video game history. But I think part of it might have been how the music would change and adapt depending on what you were doing.
Yeah.
I think I really fell in love with that theme once you're on the horse and riding at a full gallop, and then the chorus comes in.
The clarinet.
Yeah.
It was so exciting. That started with Ocarina, but Twilight Princess perfected it. Actually, Wind Waker probably was pretty much on par. Twilight Princess just had extra interactive music.
How would you describe the music of Twilight Princess, especially how it compares to other Zelda game soundtracks? Like, what about it was different to you?
It was more varied right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's out of all the games in the series, besides maybe Skyward Sword, it had the most varied soundtrack in terms of style. So that jumps out at me right away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it moved a lot away from the pre-established Link to the Past music formula, which I felt was very classical, almost like 1930s movies kind of mixed with something like Grieg or Holst, and then traditional Japanese music and Celtic music. All those things sort of came together. And then when we got to Twilight Princess, we had some of that, but there were a lot more experimental tracks. And I guess this isn't new exactly, because Ocarina of Time sort of started this, but a lot more world instruments were in it too.
I kind of feel like Twilight Princess had an almost rustic feel. Like, it had a lot of woodwinds, and it really fit with the aesthetic of the game too, how there's a lot of, really simple wooden structures and buildings and forests, and it had especially since you started out on this ranch and you're basically, herding oxen or whatever it was. Like, there was this really, woodsy style to the game. Yeah,
I know exactly what you mean. It was sort of a frontier feeling, or Wild West or pioneer feeling, and then you had that juxtaposed with the Hyrulean Roman Empire feeling.
Yeah.
It was a very strange mix, but it somehow worked.
Yeah, definitely. So when you were looking at, your arrangement of Twilight Princess, how much of that did you want to capture, and how much of it did you want to sort of spin with your own, musical style?
I wanted to... Actually, one of my goals with it was to take all the extremely varied different styles and make them all one style. Mm-hmm. I wanted to glue them together with my medley, if that makes sense. So I used instrumentation and different techniques to try and show how, even though these things feel very different, they all belong under one umbrella. Mm-hmm. I guess that the focus wasn't really on capturing the aesthetic of the music at all, but to capture the soul of it and to show that it's all the same soul. Does that make sense?
I think it definitely makes sense, especially because you're kind of repurposing these melodies and taking the story apart and putting it back together again in a completely new way. It's sort of like breathing life into a story you know well.
Ah, well, I like it when people put it that way because it makes me feel like I'm on the right track.
Good. Hopefully that's a good sign. So I guess let's walk us through the story of this arrangement, because you kind of said you had it divided into several arcs. So what was your thinking behind that?
I wanted to take the listener on an emotional journey that was simultaneously nostalgic, but breathing new life into it, as you said. Almost like they're having a new playthrough where they approach it differently and think differently and are seeing new sides to it. Mm-hmm. So I mostly followed the actual order that the song should appear in the story, with a couple exceptions. But the exceptions were often things that you could go to at any point, say the Hyrule Castle town.
What are the different movements, you would say? Like, how did you end up splitting it up in your head?
Okay, well, what I did, I actually pictured it playing like a movie while I was dreaming it up. And I wanted to start with Link relaxing at the ranch, probably lying down on the grass somewhere with a little weed in his teeth or something. And it's evening and he's had his day of work. And it plays the start of the Ordon Ranch theme and the Hawk theme almost like he's practicing blowing on the grass, maybe a couple of years before, just showing his connection to the wrench. It starts very calm, just like it does in the game. It starts with him and Russell talking, and then it plays the tune when he and Russell are heading back to the village. And it's sort of a slow anthem. Once we've set the scene and kind of got people into the game, it's almost like a fanfare. It's saying, yeah, Twilight Princess, we remember this. And I sort of shifted that departure theme into the Ordon village theme. And I imagine it playing like a movie, them slowly coming into the town as they do in the game, and walking past all the familiar doors and people going about their business, sweeping, weaving, And what I did was I made the Ordon village theme slowly get more whimsical and folky. So it starts out more sort of movie-like and dramatic, and then it gets sort of more gentle, and it shows the kind of whimsical side of... It's a fairy village, really. I mean, if you think about it, it's heavily hinted at, but it's sitting in the place Capri Forest once was, or very near it. And, even the shape of Link's window is an ivy leaf, and that's the same shape as the Outset Island male emblem from Wind Waker. And they're right next to this magical forest. First we move into Faron Woods, and that's where it gets really sort of witchy and mysterious, and more flute, more harp, and it's very green suddenly, and it's in Twilight. It's mysterious. And then I move to the Spirit Sadness, partly because it's aesthetically similar, but partly because the forest is sort of haunted with spirits in general. It's always, in every Zelda game, the forests are filled with spirits and entities and magic. And I introduced some voice, like a choir in the background of the forest, as though the spirits are watching you and singing from afar. And then they changed their tune gradually into the After the Spirit Sadness, I moved towards the Kakariko Graveyard theme, because I was thinking to myself, well, I wanted to represent all of the light spirits, not just the Faron one. And the next light spirit that you encounter after you're done Ordon and Faron is in Kakariko, and that's the next chunk of the game anyway. And I thought, Kakariko's so different from Ordon and Faron, how could I possibly bridge them? And the answer was with that magic. It's a different kind of magic in that valley, though. It's a much more sort of fiery, ancient as well, but almost alien compared to the forest magic. It's not childlike and whimsical. It's sort of solemn and very powerful. So I started with the graveyard, because the graveyard seemed like the place that would be most infested with spirits, right? So I put the drumming of the graveyard into the Spirit Sadness, and then transitioned into the... almost like it's a ceremony for the dead, and for the spirit that they all honor in Kakariko.
That's one of my favorite things about Kakariko, how it has this, it almost seems like that whole place should be barren and no one should be living there because it's so dry, and there's the whole, even from Ocarina of Time, there's the graveyard theme, and yet it's a strangely and wonderfully lively place, and everyone seems very alert and happy there, and I always liked that little juxtaposition.
Yeah, when I played through the game when I was a teenager, I had a lot of fantasies about just staying at the inn in Kakariko. Used to just wander around there at night, and I always wanted to give that little baby Goron business. Because he was so happy. He's like, oh, hello, brother,
I know. I love those guys. And, when I went there, I made it my entire mission to see how far I could fly with a cuckoo on my head.
Oh, yeah?
And there were certain platforms and cliffs that Bryan and I were always trying to see if we could get to. We probably spent a solid hour just trying to get to places with the chicken atop our domes, and it was a good time. It was a fun place.
I agree. So in Kakariko, it was very easy to transition from the graveyard to Kakariko because it had the same kind of base to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to start Kakariko with a bang, that boom, boom.
Yeah,
because the first time you hear that, it sends a chill down your spine, But at least it did for me. I bet it did for you. And then what I did was, how there are so many emotional scenes in Kakariko with all the children and whatnot, and the shaman, and I slowly softened it towards the more ethereal themes that play with the guitars. Except I didn't use a guitar, I used a mandolin in several places throughout, actually. The mandolin is to represent Hyrule. I softened it more and more and more until I could get to Lake Hylia, which also has a connection with Kakariko, not just because there's also a light spirit there, but because the Zora grave is in the graveyard there.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to bring the prince there to get him healed by the shaman. And it sort of shows the kinship between the Gorons and the Zoras and how that's been built up.
Yeah, I'm glad you were able to put them next to each other.
Yeah, and the juxtaposition's kind of neat. We go from green to red to blue, just like we do in most of the Zeldas.
And the Zora's Domain theme is just so subtle, you might even miss it.
Oh, yeah.
Neat little touch.
That was very, very quick, actually. I mostly wanted to just do the Lake Hylia theme. I thought I'd focus more on Lake Hylia, because this is the first game in the series where Lake Hylia gets its own theme.
Yeah, definitely. They put a lot of work into it. You could tell that they wanted it to be a really special part of the game.
Oh yeah, and it was. And I wanted it to sound like you just got dropped into the lake and you're immersed in the water and it's all blue and glowing and ethereal and there's Zora swimming gracefully around you and rainbow coral and a sunset with a rainbow. I wanted it to be this completely magical time for the listener where they're getting washed clean of all the dust from the previous location.
That was just part 1 of our interview with Rebecca Tripp. Tune in next week for part 2, where we run through the rest of her Twilight Princess Symphony.